Hi everyone, Kristen Ashly from Bell to Bells here, and this is Painless, a 30-minute hassle-free podcast featuring short discussions on wrestling. Each podcast I'll have one guest on to talk about one topic. Today we're switching from previewing women's wrestling events to discussing common issues found in women's wrestling creative. I'm joined in this episode by Ashley Leckwold, a wrestling writer formerly of Paste Magazine and Daily DDT, and the co-host of the awesome Power Rangers podcast, Rangersplain. How are you today, Ashley?
I'm doing all right. I've gotten like 2 naps today in between work, so let's do this.
I'm jealous. Okay, let's get into it. I'm going to start off just kind of explaining the inspiration behind this episode. So everyone who watches WWE programming is aware of the recent Lacey Evans and Ric Flair storyline. So on January 4th, on that episode of Raw, Lacey started a storyline with Ric where she began heavily flirting with him. Over the next month, Ric managed Lacey, involving his daughter Charlotte Flair in the mix here and there. On February 15th, we find out Lacey is actually really pregnant, and Creative decides to incorporate it into the storyline, where the implication is made that Flair is the father. On this week's Raw, Charlotte and Ric get into this heated discussion now that Lacey is off the show for her actual pregnancy. Mm-hmm. And Ric states he never said he was the father, but was building another legacy wrestler out of Lacey, essentially. So let's just start our chat with this incredible mess of a storyline. I won't make any assumptions, so I'll just ask first. Ashley, did you like the way Lacey's pregnancy was handled in the storyline?
Oh, man. Okay, so first of all, I haven't really been actively watching WWE television about a year and a half, probably longer, but I still keep general tabs on everything that's going on. Like, you know, like how you keep tabs on like a bad ex-boyfriend just to make sure they're not like committing tax fraud or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, I just remember seeing everyone's reaction to that and then seeing what actually happened. I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
That was a choice you could certainly make. And like, I did not really like it at all. It was just, Yeah,
I mean, it's a huge mess, and obviously it can be handled differently. Frankly, nobody is going to pretend that Ric can actually get anyone pregnant. But I mean, how do you think it could have been handled differently?
I mean, I feel like you could have gone like, I mean, because like you had the whole thing where Becky ended up, you know, leaving over last summer due to getting pregnant, but also like, you know, you have the storyline going with like, you know, Charlotte and Lacey that I feel like, especially like, because I did see the whole thing from the Royal Rumble where like Lacey hit her in the face with the brass knuckles. Yeah. And I feel like you could have easily written something where like, you know, Charlotte broke her nose or something like that, and that's why she's out for like all of a sudden, and then they would just, you know, announce her pregnancy separately.
Right.
Like, I feel like there was definitely ways you could write her out of the story without involving anybody mentally imagining that.
That. Like, you know, when I think of Becky Lynch and how they sent her off, they didn't have to write a storyline. It was just like, surprise, they let her announce it. They let her hand off the opportunity to Asuka, and that was it. And I mean, ideally, like that seems to me like a really good way of handling pregnancy, because it's treating the women like an athlete, right? Like we don't need to make this into some gimmick. I mean, I understand they were already in the middle of something, but it just seems kind of ridiculous. I mean, do you think that having more women on creative would have helped the situation?
I mean, yes and no. Like, I feel like having more women in like a creative position to actually say, hey, this is how we should be handling it, or hey, this is how you know, this is probably a better way to do this, like would probably be a better idea and might actually yield some, you know, more positive results in that factor. Like it kind of reminds me of like one of my favorite TV shows is Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, and there was actually a song that was specifically about birth on the show that was actually written by the 2 male songwriters, Jack Dolgen and the late Adam Schlesinger. But they consulted all of the women who worked on the show who had children and asked them what the experience was like.
Right.
So like at least taking in the input from women that they worked with. And, even if they're not like, a woman's not exactly in charge of that particular position, like you do get at least more creative feedback. But at the same time, with WWE's problem is more about Vince is still in charge.
Mm-hmm.
So like, and you constantly hear all these scuttlebutt rumors about how like things get written at the last minute because Vince didn't like it. And so like, I wonder, like, even if you have like women in creative that are like, that if you did have women in creative saying like, hey, this is not a great idea, maybe go this route instead, would they even be listened to?
Right. And that, I mean, that's sort of like the trump card here, right? Like anytime you think, well, they could have done this differently, or what if they had women just to be like, this is a dumb angle, or to give, like you said, a different outlook on something, doesn't even matter. And it sort of seems like, are we having these conversations for no absolute reason until Vince goes? But I feel like, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm humanizing him a little more than he deserves. I don't know. But I feel like at some point, why even have a creative team if you're not going to try to utilize it? And why not have as much diversity as you possibly can? And I know he's always going to have that trump card, but I don't know. For me, it's like I would rather us make that case and then maybe down the road it'll
Yeah. No,
yeah.
I'm not saying, that it's a futile effort to point out these issues. I'm just saying that that's sort of like, that's kind of the wall you're running up against.
Right. Sorry, drinking water. I didn't think she was going to stop so soon. As you can hear me echoing. I it is definitely a wall you run up against, and I think part of covering wrestling today is that we're aware of that. So, as much as I complain about things, I also am not in the business, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm a writer and understand what they go through, because I'm sure a lot of times it is just changed last second. But I guess we're just going to pretend for this episode that we don't have that trump card.
Right, exactly.
Right, yeah, and just at least point out where maybe women in creative could help more. And while we're making the case, frankly, I think the biggest place that could use the help is women's tag teams. And I'm going to say, this isn't just for WWE, right? I mean, this is really for like any promotion, especially with tag team wrestling. Women's tag team wrestling has always kind of fell to the wayside. But I guess WWE has more of a creative, and so that's why they're so criticized so often. But I think of the case of the Iconics, right? Like it's a huge example where not only did WWE break up one of the most over tag teams on their roster, but also where it seemed they didn't even really know what to do with them. What are your thoughts on how they handled Iconics?
Oh gosh, because similar thing happened with the Riot Squad, honestly.
Yeah.
Is like you have like these tag teams that are put together, like in the case of the Iconics, like they've been a tag team going back even beyond NXT.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they've been, Peyton and Billy have been friends and tag teaming on the indies way before then. But like, so you break up the team for no real reason, but yeah, I'm trying to put the words to it, put the words to my frustration, because it's just like, the same thing happened. Like I said, the same thing happened with the Riot Squad. Is that they broke up the team after especially they gelled so well together,
right?
And then just sort of stonewalled on what to do with Liv for 10 months before deciding, oh, we're just gonna put her back with the Riot Squad.
Right. What happened to her whole like push? Right.
Yeah.
Like, what happened to that whole thing? I feel like they get antsy.
Right.
Like I feel like every time that they have a good women's tag team, and probably men's, although I don't really pay attention to that much, like as much, but I feel like they get antsy. Like there's this really good tag team, everyone loves them, they're super over, they're super hilarious. And instead of just using that for their benefit and pushing them further, they break them up. Like they just get antsy. Like, oh, we have to do something new. This is getting too stale. And I feel like that happened with the Riot Squad too. And Sarah left, and then they really didn't know what to do.
Right.
I can't think of a women's tag team that is just stuck together for a really long time in WWE.
Yeah, because it's like I'm struggling to think either, because it's like it sort of like goes in and out as well, because like, I mean, the only one I can really think of in terms of like, staying together would be the Bella twins, honestly.
Right. Right.
Because even when like, they were, even when they were broken up, with that whole Cinderella storyline, like they were still involved in each other's business. And
Mhm.
that's not to say that like Nikki and Brie weren't doing their own things on the side, like whenever one would be out with like, pregnancy or injury, but like, you know, you still they have been the only like actual women's tag team I feel that has like stuck together in those
Right.
terms.
Yeah, and I think, well, obviously, those two just, I mean, they're an already made team, right? They're
Yeah,
twins. So
right.
so that's like super easy to do, but you think of like the formation of the women's tag teams and it's always like ad hoc. They always put like the most random pairings. They break up iconics to put more random pairings and then they break up them. And I just like I don't know if they think they're fantasy booking, but it's always like either, super besties for their
Hmm.
tag teams, or will they won't they get along? And it feels like it's just another way for them to play catfights.
Yeah,
I mean,
like yeah, because I've noticed that like right now they have Naomi and Lana tagging together.
right.
And it's like, and this wasn't like Lana tagging with like Natalia before that.
Yeah.
I, mm, I mean, I feel like at least Naomi's a little bit nicer to Lana in that regard.
Right.
But like still, it does feel so random that you're just kind of like, well, we'll just stick Lana with somebody and see what works. And then like, you have Charlotte and Asuka, which like, if they were willing to actually build them as a tag team, I could see that being really interesting. But
Yeah.
then, they're doing basically like it's basically Asuka's right there just to kind of be an accessory to Charlotte's drama.
Oh my god.
And then like I'm trying to think of like, is there any like the only like actual team I can think of that's in the women's tag division right now, minus Raquel and Dakota Kai,
Yeah.
is like, well, Raquel and Dakota Kai won. Let's add them to the list. But the only other one that's on the like on the main on the quote quote main roster is like the Riot Squad. Well,
Right.
Riot Squad 2.0, if you want to call them that.
All right.
But like, yeah, I'm just like, I struggle to think of like, there's not really a whole lot of like tag teams in the women's division that are allowed to kind of build organically,
Right.
like currently, like because you don't really have your New Day, you don't really and you don't have like Bailey and Sasha anymore.
Right.
So what else is there to do?
Right. I feel like it's, I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I feel like it's this mirror about how WWE feels about women and like friends.
Right.
Like, because you think of Lana, like Lana has gone through so many friends, right?
Right.
Like you just said, Natalia and now Naomi, she's got all these friends. And it's like, do they think that the women's friendships are so short and that they're constantly like feuding over the spotlight and then they break up? Because it feels like every time a women's wrestling tag team is like, in the vibe and getting it right, then all of a sudden they have some stupid reason to break up. And it just makes me wonder if that's how they feel women's friendships exist.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, especially like whenever they still have Lawler on commentary for women's matches, which
Mhm.
one, why? But
Right.
like, he still does that whole thing about like, oh, women just don't get along. Women can't trust each other. I'm like, have you ever actually met a woman?
Have
It's
you
like,
talked to anybody?
yeah, like, or anybody at all ever. But like, yeah, because it's like one of those things where everyone's just says like, oh, women are so catty. Women are so catty. It's like, I think women get trained to be a little bit more or emotional
Right.
and upfront about issues that they might have with somebody. But
Hmm.
like, I know plenty of women who've had very long lasting friendships, like myself included, because
Right.
my co-host on my podcast is my best friend of like 15 years.
Right.
So I really don't get the WWE logic of all women's friendships are just, cat fights waiting to happen.
Right. My best friend I've had for 20 years. And I think at this point, like, yeah, most women are more emotional. I totally agree. But at the same time, like, that's not even like a for sure thing. Like, I think about Warren. Warren is way more emotional than I am. And you would hate that I'm saying that. But, it's just this like blanket thing they put over people. And I think part of it is that they do have soap opera writers on staff, right? So they're used to creating this like very short, intense, if you've ever seen a soap opera, intense drama,
right?
And it could happen at any time,
right?
And I feel like there's definitely a reason to have those type of writers on your staff for TV, but like get a woman in there. They can tell you that this is not how women's friendships are.
Yeah. And it's like, honestly, I wish they would get more comic writers on staff.
Yes.
Because like that's like you have people that are more experienced with episodic but long form storytelling.
Right.
So like I don't know. Like I no shade to any of the soap opera writers that they have on staff. Like it's a hard job.
Yeah.
They're doing their best.
Right.
But yeah, I just like I feel like at least those two different perspectives of, have actual women involved, but also like get people that are outside of that kind of soap opera, episodic TV bubble.
Right.
And try to like, I don't know, make it more coherent, make it work, I guess.
Make it work. Make it make sense.
Yeah.
And I think you hit a really important point that in the writers, I mean, they're not the end all, right? They're not the end game here. They don't have the last say. So they do have to write within their boundaries. And I think of like, I think of feuds. Right. And we could talk forever about blatant issues with women's feuds, but I think that they have to work within these boundaries that WWE is very created, which is these stereotypes, right? So if we're talking women's feuds, one of the many examples, if we're keeping examples pretty recent, is the horrendous feud between Mandy Rose and Naomi, which essentially was over Jimmy Uso. So I'm thinking of like the horrible hotel scene that I've tried so unsuccessfully to bury in my deep memories. It seems like this is way too common with the women's roster. Storyline feuds that are written around catfights, mean girls, home wrecking, men in general. I mean, do you agree? What kind of feuds do you think we should be seeing in the women's division?
One, I definitely agree that, that's gets involved a lot, especially like when you get, when you have wrestlers that are like women's wrestlers that are married to men on the roster.
Yes.
Like all of a sudden, like we can't have like a feud that does not involve like, like as soon as like it came out that Becky was dating Seth, like all of a sudden Seth had to be involved in her things.
Right.
And it's like, no, I don't like, I like, the fact that, Keith Lee and Mia Yim are together. I don't necessarily, want Keith Lee involved in Retribution's like angles. Right. I'm not saying that he is currently, but it's like, right. I just have a feeling that's like in the back of Vince McMahon's mind. So I'm just sure. Like,
yeah.
It's like, I think for me, I would like to see kind of more stuff of like what they're doing right now with Xia Li and NXT.
Yeah.
With the whole like, God, I can't remember the name of her. I know like it's like the Dragon Warrior lady that she basically pledged allegiance to, and I cannot remember her name right now, and I feel terrible about it. But like, I know they've had that like they've recently brought in with like Kaden and Casey being like, what is going on with you? And like I like that kind of angle as a feud of just being like, and that that happened when in Impact with Allie and Sue Young or Allie and Rosemary, or just because they actually have the spooky ladies on their roster. Right. So like I love. I guess it's like the old weeb in me that just loves the kind of like friend trying to save their friend from the darkness kind of storyline. Or like, if you're gonna have like the women kind of be involved in like men's stuff, like, because like I wish that they would have more to do with like Mia in Retribution. Like, why isn't she causing havoc with the women's roster?
Right.
Or like, because it's like it kind of just feels like she's an accessory to whatever they're doing with Retribution right now, instead of like having her like be her own person.
Right.
Yeah. Like,
go ahead.
And then like, and I'm really hoping that like they do, when they get to like that, they do have Bianca face Sasha at Mania, because I just really want it to be like that. Let's see who's the best kind of feud that rarely ever seems to happen in the women's division.
Right. And like when I think of a feud that does it right, for me at least, it's Becky and Ronda.
Right.
Now, yes, there was name calling because that happens even in the men's roster, but I feel like it was more about, I'm a better wrestler than you are, and I'm going to beat your ass. And it felt more authentic. And when I think of wrestlers in the indies who go, I mean, granted, they don't have the need for the storylines to the extreme that WWE would, but when I talk to those women, it's like, yeah, no, the story is that I just want to kick her ass. And so I just think of that feud as being like, it did it all right, and most of that was because Becky, she's right. She's a mean promo, but even Ronda did her part right, where it was like she got really frustrated, and then it was just spouting at the mouth. So I think you're right there. I think the feuds that are based on like real reasons to fight and not always over a guy, it feels better that way.
Yeah, like I especially like, I want to say like, no, this was definitely like what Bayley and Sasha's feud in NXT was built around, about like the whole Bayley just wanting to prove that she was just as good as Sasha and could actually beat her.
Right.
Like, that was so good. Like, it wasn't like, it's not break the bank storytelling. Not break the bank storytelling. I meant to say, it's not like a break the bank feud in terms of originality, but like you get the right components there, and like it can work so well. And like, there's proof there that it can work so well. And yet like it still seems that like for every one of those storylines we get at least like 5 more, like, women being catty to each other, or storylines with women that just sort of seem to peter out and go nowhere, or just revolved around the dumbest things.
Right. Like Jimmy Uso. Like, so, I think of like, so kind of what you said about like Su Yung and Rosemary, and how I really dig like the very, very creative stuff. Like, had they done Alexa Bliss right, that whole thing.
Right.
Very creative stuff, because it gets you really involved in the story. Or like you said, like a Bayley and Sasha storyline, because not only is it just simpler and actually treats women like athletes, but it also has a lot more room to grow.
Right.
Like, if you get into this Lacey Evans versus Charlotte Flair nonsense, and now all of a sudden Lacey Evans is knocked up, where do you have to go from there? Then they have to create these promos like they did on Raw this week, to explain away what really happened. And so then I find myself like, with those storylines, it just drops. I mean, there's been like a couple times recently, watching Raw or SmackDown to Warren, I've said, wait, what happened with this? What happened with this storyline? Because they get too convoluted.
Right. No, I remember my first year into wrestling, where they had that whole storyline about Lana breaking up with Rusev. And then like dating Dolph, and then like it went on for like, I want to say like 6 months, or it felt like it went on for 6 months if it wasn't a full 6 months.
Right.
And it just eventually petered out when like the news leaked that Lana and Rusev got engaged. Right. So like the only way they could think to like get their way out of that was like have Summer confront like Rusev about it, and then like get Tyler Breeze on the main roster, and then it was just over.
Well, and then it eventually converted down the road to now she's with Lashley, and then Liv breaks up the wedding. But
Yeah,
they
and
even
then
got very
like
creative with that angle, which should have
yeah.
been a really good angle. It's terrible. And I think with the time that we have left, we've kind of already talked about it a little bit, but I just want to talk briefly about the issues surrounding women's characters in general.
Mhm.
It feels like WWE falls back constantly on old stereotypes when it comes to handing out gimmicks or when people have gimmicks and they return to, they go to main roster. So, like for me, the biggest thorn in my side is what they've done to Nikki Cross. I mean, when I first started watching NXT, she was still there and she was the Twisted Sister. She was insane. She came out to music that it was just a scream. It was
Yeah.
a scream. And she came out in like a wife beater, a white tank top and just like regular slacks and crazy hair. And she hadn't showered in a week and just tore it up. And her look and feel was so different. And then not like 6 months after she arrives to main roster, she's like got all this makeup on. I mean, she looks great, but she's got all this makeup on. She's got her hair all fancy. She's Alexa Bliss's sidekick. Her music is now like this weird country music rock mix. I don't know what it
Or
is. And it makes me so angry because it happens every single time. I mean, do you think that they fall back on just a handful of stereotypes for the women?
I think they do, yeah. And it's like it feels like anytime there's like a quote weird girl,
Yeah.
like they don't really know what to do with. Like, it kind of happened with Paige, it
Yes.
happened with Nikki, it kind of happened with Ruby, which
Right.
thank God she finally gets to have short hair on the roster again because like that, I those extensions were not doing her any favors,
No.
unfortunately.
No.
Um, but like it's just like it feels like whenever they have somebody who's kind of just a little bit outside of that, that established WWE box,
Hmm.
like they got to find a way to like kind of reverse course on that because they don't know what to do.
Right.
And like I am so afraid of what would happen if like Shotzi got called
Oh
up. I was like, oh
God.
no. Like, because they're at NXT, they're just letting her be herself and it's
Right.
working.
I know. I'm actually very, very nervous for her too. And I spoke with her recently about it because I was
Uh-huh.
like, they just let her walk in with the tank and the horns and everything.
Yeah.
And didn't even change her name. And they take poor Priscilla Kelly and just rip it all from her. I'm so nervous with Priscilla Kelly.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
I think you're right on the nail with the weird, or not even weird, but like different
Yeah.
girl. Yeah.
And so, like, I would just like to see them try to let them, like, the women be more of themselves.
Hmm.
Because, like, we see I mean, this is obviously not just a women's roster problem. Like, we've seen it with the men's roster for years that it isn't until, like, somebody's really established on the roster that they finally get to be themselves. Like, it happened with Roman Reigns for years.
Right.
And, like, and now he's finally getting to be like, obviously he's a heel right now, but he's like getting to be a little bit more of his own personality
Right.
versus like doing like whatever canned promo that like, because there was that ebb and flow for years of like they had let Roman lead himself and then they would just not. And then
Yeah.
and like it just seems like for the women's roster, like you get that so rarely. Like you got that with Becky, where you got to see more of like her own kind of
Hmm.
personality shining through when she got to become the man.
Right.
Um, but like yeah, it's that one thing is like, especially with the women's roster, I just wish they would let them be more of themselves and just let them go out there and do their own thing. Cause I feel like that would be way more effective than like, trying to like make Nikki Cross into Alexa Bliss's sidekick, and
Right.
her all of a sudden her main storyline becomes she's concerned about Alexa turning to the dark side.
Which makes, oh my God, makes absolutely no sense, right? Like
Yeah.
old Nikki Cross would have loved it. And
Yeah.
I think you're right. The whole episode is based on making a case for women in creative. And I mean, at some point, I would say that the women get pushed further into stereotypes. But you're right. Like, I think of when I first started watching WWE, it was New Day was this heel faction,
Mm.
and their intro was like choir music. And it was so weird. And when they finally let them just do their thing, now they're just so lovable, and there's no way they could ever be heel again, frankly. Like, when there's no turning back now.
Right.
And I've always said that, when WWE lets their talent be themselves, like in the case of Bayley,
Right.
who's gone on record and said that this heel turn was, this heel character right now, not at first, but now it's her making. She's phenomenal now.
Oh yeah, like what I've seen of her heel character, she's so funny.
Right.
Like she's definitely somebody you want to see get hit in the face, because like she's so obnoxious, but you kind of love her for it.
Yeah. I mean, it works if you let your talent lean hard into their skill set, like they're letting Shotzi do.
Right.
There's no losing.
Yeah. And then just gonna say out here, I think if they wanted to keep the whole anarchy angle with Retribution, Nikki Cross would have been a great pick for that. But whatever.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Mia Yim is wonderful. And we don't have time to get into all the horribleness that is Retribution, frankly. How they
went an episode in itself.
Yeah, they went from anarchy to whatever. They're just jobbers now. So that's like a whole nother podcast. But I want to thank you, so much, Ashley, for joining me on this third episode. I really enjoyed this discussion. There are discussions I feel like a lot of women's wrestling fans want to have, and which already do, frankly. I see this discussion a lot on Twitter. But I'm just so grateful I was able to have you on to share your insight. I know you've talked about this a little bit in previous work. Before we wrap it up, where can people find you?
Well, first of all, thank you again so much for having me. I had a great time. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at MissKittyF. So it's MISSKITTYF. Old backwards Buffy the Vampire Slayer reference, and I almost don't want to get rid of it now.
Too good.
Yeah. And then for my podcast, you can find it on Twitter and Instagram as well at Rangersplain. So our next episode will be out on March the 1st, where we discussed the Saban era TV series VR Troopers. It is a time. And then yeah, that's where you can find me. Oh, I also do sell zines and masks on my own shop, and I'm actually going to be kind of doing a soft relaunch soon. Like, the store hasn't closed. I just haven't had time to really focus on it. But yeah, I'm going to be doing a relaunch of some stock soon. But yeah, you can find that at Ashley-Leckwold at square.site. If you go to my Twitter account, there's a link tree there. Takes you to everything I do. So yeah, that's where you can find me on
Twitter. So be sure to follow her. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Kristen Ashly. Be sure to follow Bell to Bells on Twitter. Visit belltobells.com for all of your women's wrestling news, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interviews and new episodes of Painless. Stay safe until next time.